12-year-old girls don't kill grown men. They don't outsmart experienced overseers. They don't orchestrate deaths so precise that entire communities mistake murder for misfortune. But across 3 cotton plantations in Burke County, Georgia, 17 men died under circumstances no one could explain. The deaths began in late March of 1851 and continued for nearly 4 years. Each victim had one thing in common. They wielded power over the enslaved. Medical examiners found nothing suspicious. Plantation owners blamed accidents, disease, and bad luck. The local sheriff closed every investigation within days. What they never discovered was that 2 identical faces watched each death unfold with eyes that held no fear, no guilt, and no mercy whatsoever. Before we continue with the story of what happened in Burke County, I need you to do something for me. If you're enjoying this dark piece of American history, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this. And I'm curious, where are you listening from? Drop your state or city in the comments below. Now let me tell you about Sarah and Margaret Hutchins and the 4 years that changed everything in Burke County. The spring of 1851 found Burke County in the midst of its most profitable cotton season in a decade. The Hutchins plantation, locally known as Hutchins Fields, sprawled across 800 acres of prime Georgia soil, approximately 12 miles south of Waynesboro. 347 souls lived and worked that land, their lives governed by rhythms older than memory. Dawn bells, cotton rows stretching to horizons, the crack of leather on human skin. William Hutchins had inherited the property from his father in 1843, and under his management, production had doubled. He was known throughout the county as a shrewd businessman, a church deacon, and a man who kept meticulous records. Every bale of cotton, every birth, every death, every dollar spent, all documented in leather-bound ledgers that filled an entire wall of his study. His wife, Eleanor, managed the household with similar precision, overseeing the domestic workforce with a coldness that required no raised voice. The Hutchins had purchased Sarah and Margaret in January of 1851 from a trader passing through Augusta. The girls were listed in the bill of sale as twin females, approximately 12 years of age, both in good health, trained for domestic service. No surname was recorded. No parents were mentioned. They arrived at Hutchins Fields on a Tuesday afternoon, riding in the back of a wagon with 7 other newly purchased individuals, their identical faces betraying no emotion as they surveyed their new home. The head overseer, a man named Robert Thaddeus Crane, processed the arrivals with the efficiency of long practice. Crane had worked at Hutchins Fields for 6 years, earning a reputation as a man who maintained discipline without excessive brutality, a distinction that mattered in that time and place. He was 42 years old, built like an oak barrel, with hands that could snap a shovel handle and a voice that carried across 20 acres. He assigned Sarah and Margaret to work under the supervision of his wife, Martha, who managed the kitchen and laundry operations. What no one noticed in those early weeks was how the twins watched everything. Not with the frightened furtiveness of new arrivals, but with a focused intensity that absorbed every detail. They noted which overseers rode which routes at which times. They observed the hierarchy among the enslaved population, who held influence, who harbored grudges, who could be trusted with a secret. They studied the physical layout of the plantation with the precision of military strategists, learning every building, every path, every place where someone might be alone. Martha Crane initially found the girls unsettling. "They don't speak unless spoken to," she mentioned to her husband one evening in March. "And when they look at you, it's like they're counting something behind their eyes." Robert dismissed her concerns. Silent obedience, he reminded her, was preferable to the alternative. The twins worked in perfect synchronization. When one carried water, the other anticipated exactly when she would need assistance. They seemed to communicate without words, a glance sufficient to coordinate complex tasks. The other women in the kitchen began to notice that Sarah and Margaret never made mistakes, not small ones, not large ones. Every instruction was followed precisely, every duty completed exactly as specified. This perfection made them nearly invisible, servants so reliable that adults stopped paying attention to their presence. By late March, the twins had been at Hutchins Fields for less than 3 months. They knew the name of every overseer and field supervisor. They understood the daily patterns of each one. They had identified the storage locations of tools, the maintenance schedules for equipment, the routes traveled by men who worked alone. And they had begun to watch one particular individual with special attention, a man named Vernon Cushing, who served as overseer for the East Cotton Fields. Vernon Cushing was 28 years old, unmarried, and known throughout Burke County for his cruelty. Where other overseers maintained discipline through intimidation and occasional punishment, Cushing seemed to derive pleasure from causing pain. He was particularly brutal toward women and children, a fact that Robert Crane had cautioned him about more than once. But Cushing was effective at maintaining production quotas, and William Hutchins valued results above methods. The twins had watched Cushing for 3 weeks before they made their decision. They observed his habits with scientific precision. Every morning, he rode his horse along a narrow path through a stand of pine trees that bordered the eastern fields. The path connected the slave quarters to the work areas, cutting through terrain that grew muddy after rain. Cushing always rode this path alone, always at the same time. Approximately 15 minutes after the dawn bell, when most of the enslaved population had already moved to their workstations. On the morning of March 28, 1851, conditions were perfect. Heavy rain had fallen throughout the previous night, turning the pine path into a treacherous mixture of red clay and standing water. The twins rose before dawn, slipping from the kitchen quarters while darkness still covered the plantation. They carried nothing but a short piece of rope they had taken from the stable 3 days earlier. What happened next took less than 5 minutes. The twins had selected a spot where the path narrowed between 2 large pines, where recent rains had created a depression that collected several inches of water. They strung the rope across the path at precisely the right height, low enough to catch a horse's front legs, high enough to be invisible in the pre-dawn darkness and muddy water. Then they retreated to a position 20 yards distant and waited. Vernon Cushing rode through at his usual time. His horse hit the rope at full trot. The animal's front legs tangled and physics took over. The horse went down hard, throwing Cushing forward. He landed face first in the muddy depression, the impact driving the air from his lungs. The horse, panicking, rolled partially over its rider in the struggle to regain footing. By the time other workers found Cushing, he had drowned in 8 inches of muddy water, his nose and mouth clogged with Georgia clay. The twins had already retrieved their rope and returned to the kitchen before anyone noticed Cushing's absence. They were preparing breakfast when the shouting began, when men ran toward the pine path, when Robert Crane himself galloped past the kitchen house. Sarah and Margaret continued their work without pause, their identical faces showing nothing but mild curiosity when Martha rushed in with the news. "Vernon Cushing is dead," Martha announced, her voice shaking. "His horse threw him in the mud down by the east path. Drowned in a puddle, they're saying. Can you imagine? A grown man drowned in a puddle." The twins nodded sympathetically and returned to kneading dough for the morning bread. The investigation, such as it was, concluded within hours. The sheriff rode out from Waynesboro, examined the scene, and determined that tragic accidents happened on muddy paths. The horse had clearly lost footing in the treacherous conditions. Cushing's death was ruled misadventure. He was buried 2 days later in the small cemetery behind the Baptist church in Waynesboro, and life at Hutchins Fields continued without interruption. But something had changed, though only 2 people recognized it. Sarah and Margaret had discovered that careful planning could produce results that appeared completely natural. They had learned that adults, when presented with a plausible accident, would accept it without question. And they had identified 16 more names on their list. The death of Vernon Cushing created a temporary void in the overseer hierarchy at Hutchins Fields. William Hutchins promoted one of the field supervisors, a man named Douglas Pritchard, to fill the position. Pritchard was 40 years old, a Georgia native who had worked in plantation management since his 20s. He had a wife and 3 children living in Waynesboro, and he was known as a competent but unremarkable overseer, neither exceptionally cruel nor particularly lenient. The twins watched Pritchard for 2 weeks before adding him to their list. What sealed his fate was an incident on April 16th when they witnessed him strike an elderly man named Samuel for moving too slowly during cotton loading. The blow itself was not unusual by the standards of that time and place, but Pritchard had used a shovel handle and Samuel had been sick with fever. The old man collapsed and didn't rise for several minutes. Pritchard kicked him twice before walking away. Sarah and Margaret made their decision that afternoon. Douglas Pritchard would be the second name. Pritchard's routine differed from Cushing's. He lived in Waynesboro and rode to Hutchins Fields each morning, arriving around 6 o'clock. His horse was stabled overnight at the plantation, fed and prepared by an enslaved stable hand named Jacob. Pritchard stored his saddle and riding equipment in the stable's tack room, where various pieces of leather gear and metal hardware hung from wooden pegs. The twins had access to the stable area because they carried kitchen scraps for the pigs housed in a pen adjacent to the building. Over the course of several days, they studied the tack room's contents and Pritchard's equipment. His saddle was well-maintained leather, his stirrups solid iron, his girth strap secured with a standard buckle. Everything appeared normal because everything was normal, until the twins made a small modification. On the evening of April 29th, while Jacob was occupied with feeding duties and the stable area stood empty, Sarah and Margaret slipped into the tack room. What they did took less than 2 minutes. Using a piece of broken glass Sarah had carefully sharpened on a stone, they made a series of shallow cuts on the underside of Pritchard's girth strap, the leather band that secured the saddle to the horse. The cuts were precise, invisible from casual inspection, but strategically placed to create weakness in the leather. They didn't cut all the way through. That would have been obvious. Instead, they compromised the strap's integrity just enough that it would fail under the right conditions, specifically under the stress of a rider mounting a horse or during vigorous riding. The weakened strap would hold initially but would tear gradually under repeated stress. Douglas Pritchard rode to Hutchins Fields without incident on the morning of April 30th. His saddle felt secure, his girth strap held firm. He conducted his morning inspection of the East Fields, riding at a steady pace across relatively level ground. Everything seemed normal because nothing was wrong yet. Leather degradation under stress is a gradual process. The strap began to fail around mid-morning. Pritchard was riding between cotton rows when his horse startled at a snake. The animal jumped sideways, then began to run. Pritchard, an experienced horseman, maintained control initially, but the sudden movement and the horse's speed created intense stress on the already compromised girth strap. The leather tore with a sound like ripping cloth. The saddle rotated sideways, and Pritchard fell hard onto packed Georgia earth. His left foot remained caught in the stirrup. The panicked horse dragged him approximately 40 yards before several field workers managed to catch the animal and free the trapped overseer. Douglas Pritchard suffered a fractured skull, multiple broken ribs, and severe abrasions across his back and shoulders. He died 3 hours later in the plantation's infirmary, never regaining consciousness. The doctor who examined him, a man named Harrison Pierce from Waynesboro, attributed the death to injuries sustained from the fall and subsequent dragging. The failed girth strap was noted as the cause of the accident. William Hutchins examined the broken leather himself. Old equipment, he concluded. Wear and tear. He made a note in his ledger to inspect all riding gear for similar deterioration. The strap itself was discarded. No one thought to examine it closely for the pattern of cuts that had initiated its failure. Sarah and Margaret learned of Pritchard's death while serving lunch in the main house. Eleanor Hutchins mentioned it to her husband in their presence, discussing the need to find another replacement overseer. The twins maintained appropriate expressions of surprise and continued serving food without interruption. That night, lying in their shared sleeping space in the kitchen quarters, Sarah whispered a single word to her sister. 3. Margaret understood. They had eliminated 2 men, who held power over others through violence. But their list contained 15 more names, and they had just refined their methodology. The pattern had been established. Make deaths appear accidental, use methods that required minimal intervention. Strike when opportunities presented themselves. Leave no evidence that couldn't be explained by natural causes or simple misfortune. Most importantly, remain invisible. The perfect servants, the silent twins, the girls no one really noticed. What made their campaign particularly effective was the context of plantation life in 1851 Georgia. Death was common. Accidents happened with regularity. Medical knowledge was limited, and investigations into the deaths of overseers rarely extended beyond surface-level examination. The twins had intuited something that would serve them well. In a world where tragedy was expected, additional tragedy would not seem suspicious. But they had also learned something else from Douglas Pritchard's death. The other enslaved workers at Hutchins Fields had shown no grief when the overseer died. Several had whispered prayers of thanks when they thought no one could hear. The twins realized they weren't acting in isolation. They were enacting a form of justice that others desired but couldn't pursue themselves. This realization shaped their next decisions. They began to pay careful attention to the experiences of others. They noted which overseers inflicted the most severe punishments. They observed which supervisors showed gratuitous cruelty beyond what was required to maintain discipline. They listened to whispered conversations about past abuses, stored grudges, and remembered suffering. Their list of names became more than random targets. Each name represented someone who had earned their position through specific actions. And Sarah and Margaret took their time, never rushing, always waiting for the perfect opportunity to present itself. May passed quietly at Hutchins Fields. William Hutchins hired a new overseer named Thomas Crawford, a man from South Carolina, with 20 years of plantation experience. Crawford proved competent and, by the standards of the time, relatively restrained in his disciplinary methods. The twins watched him but made no moves. Crawford had not yet earned a place on their list. Robert Crane, the head overseer, noticed the twins during this period. Not because they did anything wrong, but because they did everything right. They were 12 years old and worked with the efficiency of adults. They never complained, never showed fatigue, never made errors. This perfection should have been remarkable, but in the context of plantation life, it simply made them valuable property. Crane mentioned to William Hutchins that the twin girls were proving to be excellent acquisitions. What Crane didn't mention, because he didn't notice, was that the twins had begun leaving the kitchen quarters at night. Not every night, and never for long periods. But once or twice a week, Sarah and Margaret would slip out after the evening meal service ended and darkness covered the plantation grounds. They moved through shadows like they had been born to it, visiting locations they had identified during daylight hours, studying equipment and structures, planning future accidents. They were methodical in ways that seemed impossible for children their age. They understood leverage and weight distribution. They recognized structural weaknesses in buildings and equipment. They intuited the relationship between cause and effect, with a clarity that suggested either unusual intelligence or extensive prior experience, though no one who looked at their documented history would have suspected either. The bill of sale that brought them to Hutchins Fields noted only that they had been trained for domestic service. It didn't mention where this training had occurred or what experiences had shaped them before January 1851. The trader who sold them to William Hutchins had purchased them at an estate auction in Augusta, providing no information beyond what appeared in the documentation. Sarah and Margaret themselves never spoke about their past, and no one thought to ask 12-year-old enslaved girls about their previous lives. But something had formed them. Something had taught them to watch, to calculate, to wait for opportunities, and to act without hesitation when those opportunities arrived. Whether this education had come from observation, instruction, or pure survival instinct, the result was the same. Two 12-year-old girls who killed adults with the precision of experienced executioners. On June 14, 1851, they claimed their third victim. His name was Harold Simmons, and he served as supervisor for the cotton gin operation. Simmons was 34 years old, known throughout Burke County for his efficiency in processing cotton and his violence toward anyone who damaged equipment or slowed production. He had personally whipped at least 24 individuals during his 3 years at Hutchins Fields, several of whom still bore visible scars. The cotton gin building was a large wooden structure housing the mechanical equipment used to separate cotton fibers from seeds. The machinery was powered by a horse-driven external wheel system, with leather belts and wooden gears transmitting power to the processing mechanisms. The building also housed storage for processed cotton, awaiting transport to the markets in Augusta and Savannah. Harold Simmons spent most of his working hours inside this building, supervising the feeding of raw cotton into the machinery and the collection of processed fibers. He was a hands-on supervisor, frequently adjusting equipment and demonstrating proper techniques. This meant he worked in close proximity to moving machinery throughout the day, machinery that required constant vigilance to operate safely. The twins had delivered water to the cotton gin building numerous times over the previous 2 months. They had observed the machinery's operation and Simmons's habits. They noticed that he was particularly careless around the main drive belt, a wide leather strap that transferred power from the external wheel system to the interior processing mechanisms. This belt ran through an opening in the wall approximately 6 feet above the floor, moving at considerable speed when the system was operational. On June 14th, the twins made their move during the afternoon shift change. The machinery had been shut down for 15 minutes to allow workers to rotate. Simmons was alone in the building, conducting his routine inspection of the equipment before operations resumed. Sarah and Margaret entered carrying water buckets, as expected and therefore invisible. What happened next took seconds. Sarah had concealed a length of thin but strong rope in the bottom of her water bucket, covered by the water itself. As Margaret engaged Simmons in conversation, a rare event that captured his full attention because the silent twins never spoke without direct prompting, Sarah moved to the area near the main drive belt. She secured one end of the rope to a support beam near the belt opening, allowing the other end to dangle loosely near where Simmons stood. The rope itself was unremarkable. Standard plantation rope used for hundreds of purposes, but its placement was deliberate. When the machinery resumed operation and the drive belt began moving, the loose end of the rope would be caught by the belt's motion and rapidly wound up. Anything connected to that rope would be pulled violently toward the moving machinery. Margaret asked Simmons about proper cotton feeding techniques, keeping his attention focused away from where Sarah worked. Her question was intelligent enough to require a detailed answer, which Simmons provided while demonstrating with hand gestures. As he spoke, Sarah completed her preparation and rejoined her sister. The twins departed the building with their water buckets, leaving Simmons alone with the rope system they had created. The afternoon shift began 17 minutes later. Workers resumed their positions, and the external wheel system was engaged. The machinery came to life with its characteristic creaking and grinding sounds. The main drive belt began to move, its leather surface traveling at approximately 8 feet per second. Harold Simmons was standing near the belt opening, examining cotton samples, when the loose rope was caught by the belt's motion. The rope snapped tight, and the wooden beam to which it was secured cracked under the sudden tension. Part of the beam broke free and was pulled by the rope toward the belt opening, and Simmons was standing directly in its path. The beam section struck Simmons in the side of the head with tremendous force, the impact driven by the machinery's mechanical advantage. He fell into the operating equipment. Workers shut down the machinery immediately, but Harold Simmons was already dead, his neck broken by the initial impact with the beam. The investigation concluded that a rope had somehow become entangled in the machinery, causing a structural failure that resulted in Simmons's accidental death. Such accidents, while uncommon, were not unprecedented in cotton processing facilities. The equipment was examined and deemed to have no inherent defects. The incident was recorded as an industrial accident, and Harold Simmons was buried 3 days later. Sarah and Margaret learned of the death while serving dinner in the main house that evening. William Hutchins was discussing the incident with his wife, expressing frustration about losing another experienced supervisor within such a short period. 3 men in less than 3 months, he said, shaking his head. Bad luck seems to follow this place lately. The twins cleared plates and poured water, their identical faces showing appropriate concern. That night, in the darkness of their sleeping quarters, Margaret whispered to her sister, 14 more. Sarah said nothing, but her expression in the dim moonlight suggested agreement. The summer of 1851 brought oppressive heat to Burke County, the kind that made cotton fields shimmer in the distance and turned every physical task into an endurance test. Production continued at Hutchins Fields despite the recent deaths, though William Hutchins noticed that finding qualified overseers had become more difficult. Word had spread through the county about the unusual string of accidents at his plantation, and experienced men were increasingly reluctant to accept positions there. By August, Hutchins had managed to fill the vacant positions, though with less experienced personnel than he preferred. The new overseers included a man named George Whitfield, who took over the cotton gin operation, and Charles Drummond, who supervised the field crews. Both men were younger than their predecessors, both eager to prove themselves, and both would be dead before the year ended. The twins had expanded their area of observation beyond the boundaries of Hutchins Fields. On Sundays, when some of the enslaved population was permitted to attend religious services in Waynesboro, Sarah and Margaret accompanied Martha Crane to the Baptist church. During these trips, they observed the broader community of Burke County, noting the relationships between plantation owners, the movements of local officials, and the patterns of life in the small town. They discovered that Hutchins Fields was not isolated. Overseers and supervisors regularly moved between plantations, sharing information and occasionally transferring to other properties. This created opportunities. A man who earned a place on the twins' list while working at Hutchins Fields might later be accessible at a different location. Sarah and Margaret began to think beyond the boundaries of their immediate environment, but they also became more cautious. 3 deaths in 4 months had generated conversation, and while no one suspected murder, the unusual frequency of accidents had drawn attention. The twins understood that continued activity at Hutchins Fields would eventually create suspicion. They needed to vary their methods, their timing, and potentially their locations. George Whitfield died on September 3, 1851. His death appeared to be the result of cotton dust inhalation, a known hazard in processing facilities. What no one discovered was that Sarah had deliberately loosened a joint in the ventilation system, concentrating dust in the area where Whitfield worked. The accumulation over several weeks had created conditions that, combined with Whitfield's existing respiratory sensitivity, proved fatal. The death was ruled natural causes, attributed to the occupational hazards of cotton processing. Charles Drummond lasted until November. His death occurred during a routine inspection of field equipment when a wagon loaded with cotton bales shifted unexpectedly, crushing him against a storage building wall. Investigation revealed that the wagon's brake system had failed. No one discovered that Margaret had carefully weakened the brake mechanism over the course of 2 weeks, creating a delayed failure that appeared entirely mechanical. William Hutchins stood in his study on November 24, 1851, staring at his ledger entries. 5 overseers and supervisors dead in 8 months. Statistically improbable, but not impossible. Each death had a reasonable explanation. Each investigation had concluded accidental death. And yet, something troubled him about the pattern. He mentioned his concerns to Robert Crane during their weekly planning meeting. 5 men, Robert, in 8 months. Have you ever seen anything like it? Crane admitted he had not. But he also pointed out that each incident had been thoroughly investigated by Sheriff Morgan from Waynesboro, and each time the conclusion had been the same: tragic accident. Sometimes bad luck concentrates in one place for a while, Crane suggested. Then it passes. What neither man considered was that the bad luck was being meticulously planned by two 12-year-old girls who moved through their daily routines with perfect obedience while studying their next targets with predatory focus. The twins had learned valuable lessons from their first 5 eliminations. They understood the importance of patience, of allowing time to pass between incidents. They recognized the need for variety in methods. Too many similar accidents would eventually raise questions. They had discovered that complex plans requiring multiple steps were more difficult to trace than simple, direct actions. And they had realized that appearing helpful and concerned after each death made them even more invisible to investigation. By December 1851, Sarah and Margaret had been at Hutchins Fields for 11 months. They had killed 5 men. They had 14 names remaining on their original list, and they had added 3 more names based on observations during the summer and fall. They worked with the same efficiency and obedience that had characterized their first months at the plantation. They spoke only when necessary. They made no mistakes. They remained perfectly invisible, but they were also watching developments beyond Hutchins Fields. During Sunday trips to Waynesboro, they had observed that other plantations in Burke County employed overseers and supervisors who used similar methods of control and discipline. The system that created men like Vernon Cushing and Harold Simmons existed throughout the county, throughout Georgia, throughout the entire South. Their list could be longer, much longer. In January of 1852, the twins turned 13 years old, though no one at Hutchins Fields knew their exact birth date or thought to celebrate it. They marked the occasion privately, in the darkness of their quarters, by reviewing their progress and planning their next moves. 17 names remained on their list. They estimated they could eliminate 3 more at Hutchins Fields before suspicion became unavoidable. After that, they would need to adapt their approach. The death toll at Hutchins Fields had created an unexpected effect among the enslaved population. While no one openly celebrated the deaths of overseers, there was a noticeable decrease in the most brutal forms of punishment. The remaining supervisors, aware of their colleagues' fates and unnerved by the pattern of accidents, became more cautious in their actions. Some moderated their behavior out of genuine superstition. Perhaps the plantation really was cursed. Others simply recognized that harsh discipline wasn't worth risking the bad luck that seemed to follow those who wielded it most enthusiastically. Sarah and Margaret observed these changes with satisfaction. Their campaign was having effects beyond the immediate elimination of specific individuals. They were creating an environment where fear ran in multiple directions. The 6th death occurred on February 18, 1852. The victim was a field supervisor named Arnold Fletcher, 39 years old, known for his use of a leather strap to maintain work pace in the cotton fields. Fletcher's death appeared to be a simple drowning. He had been crossing a swollen creek on horseback during a winter rainstorm when his horse lost footing and both rider and animal were swept downstream. Fletcher's body was recovered 2 miles from the crossing point. The horse survived. What investigators didn't discover was that the twins had observed Fletcher's routine crossings for 3 weeks, noting that he always used the same ford location and always crossed during his afternoon inspection rounds. On the morning of February 18th, knowing that heavy rain was forecast, the twins had visited the creek and used a wooden pole to deepen the underwater depression at Fletcher's usual crossing point. They worked quickly, creating a hole approximately 3 feet deeper than the surrounding creek bed. When Fletcher's horse stepped into this depression during the storm-swollen crossing, the sudden change in depth caused the animal to panic and lose footing. Fletcher drowned in a creek he had crossed hundreds of times before. His death was ruled accidental, another casualty of Georgia's unpredictable winter weather. The 7th death followed 3 months later, in May of 1852. James Pritchard, younger brother of Douglas Pritchard, who had died in April 1851, had taken a position at Hutchins Fields specifically to investigate his brother's death. He didn't believe the official explanation of equipment failure. He suspected something more deliberate was occurring at the plantation. James Pritchard spent 2 months studying the plantation's operations, interviewing workers, and examining the sites of previous accidents. He was methodical and intelligent. and he was beginning to identify patterns that troubled him. He noticed, for example, that several of the deaths had occurred in locations that the twin girls had regular access to. He observed that Sarah and Margaret seemed to be present in the vicinity of accidents with unusual frequency. But before Pritchard could formalize his suspicions or present them to William Hutchins, he died in a stable fire. The blaze started just after midnight on May 9, 1852, apparently from a lantern that had been left burning in the tack room. Pritchard had been sleeping in quarters adjacent to the stable. He died of smoke inhalation before the fire could be controlled. The stable and most of its contents were destroyed. What no one discovered was that the twins had started the fire deliberately, using a careful arrangement of oil-soaked rags and slow-burning materials that would ignite hours after they left the area. They had learned that Pritchard was asking questions, and they had eliminated him before those questions could become dangerous. But James Pritchard's death marked a turning point. His investigation, though incomplete, had identified genuine patterns. More importantly, he had documented his concerns in letters to his wife in South Carolina, expressing his belief that something criminal was occurring at Hutchins Fields. After his death, these letters reached William Hutchins through Pritchard's widow, who demanded answers about her husband's demise. For the first time, serious questions were being asked. And for the first time, Sarah and Margaret recognized that their activities at Hutchins Fields had reached a natural conclusion. They had been at the plantation for 16 months. They had killed 7 men. Their remaining targets would have to wait, or would have to be pursued elsewhere. The twins began planning their departure. Sheriff Clayton Morgan arrived at Hutchins Fields on May 24, 1852, carrying the letters written by James Pritchard before his death. Morgan was 53 years old, a Burke County native who had served as sheriff for 12 years. He was known as a fair but practical man, someone who understood that plantation life operated under rules different from those governing life in Waynesboro proper. But the letters troubled him enough to warrant a personal visit and detailed questioning. William Hutchins received the sheriff in his study, offering whiskey and cigars, while maintaining a composed exterior that masked genuine concern. 7 deaths in 14 months. Written accusations from a deceased overseer. The potential for scandal was significant. Morgan laid out the contents of Pritchard's letters with careful precision. The deceased overseer had documented the dates and circumstances of each death at Hutchins Fields. He had noted patterns in the timing and locations of accidents. He had observed that many of the victims were known for particularly harsh discipline. And he had mentioned, in his final letter dated 3 days before his death, that he suspected deliberate agency in these misfortunes, though I cannot yet identify the agent. "Did Pritchard share these concerns with you?" Morgan asked Hutchins. "He mentioned he was troubled by the coincidence of so many accidents," Hutchins acknowledged, "but he never suggested anything criminal, and certainly never accused any specific individual." "His widow believes her husband was murdered," Morgan said bluntly. "She's demanding a full investigation." What followed was the most thorough examination ever conducted at Hutchins Fields. Sheriff Morgan spent 3 days at the plantation, interviewing overseers, supervisors, and selected members of the enslaved population. He examined the sites of previous accidents. He reviewed equipment and structures. He compiled testimony and documentation. Sarah and Margaret were interviewed along with dozens of others. Morgan spoke to them in the presence of Martha Crane, asking routine questions about their duties and whether they had witnessed anything unusual. The twins responded with appropriate deference, describing their daily routines and admitting they had been present near several of the accident sites. But then, they were frequently moving around the plantation in the course of their kitchen duties, so this seemed unremarkable. Morgan noted their presence near multiple incidents but saw nothing inherently suspicious in it. They were 12-year-old girls, recently turned 13, small for their age, always together, always obedient. The idea that they could have engineered the deaths of 7 adult men seemed absurd on its surface. After 3 days of investigation, Sheriff Morgan concluded that while the pattern of deaths was unusual and troubling, no evidence existed to suggest criminal activity. Each incident had plausible explanations. Each could be attributed to accident or misfortune. James Pritchard's suspicions, while understandable, appeared to be the result of grief over his brother's death, rather than based in factual evidence. Sometimes, Morgan told William Hutchins before departing, bad luck concentrates in one place for a period of time, then it passes. I suspect your troubles are behind you now. But Morgan added one recommendation. Consider rotating your supervisory staff. Bring in new people, perhaps from other counties. Fresh eyes might break whatever pattern has been established here. Hutchins took this advice. Over the following weeks, he made significant changes to his overseer structure. Robert Crane remained as head overseer. His competence and long service made him irreplaceable, but most of the other supervisory positions were filled with men from outside Burke County. These new employees brought different methods and different routines, disrupting the patterns that Sarah and Margaret had studied so carefully. The twins recognized the implications immediately. Their detailed knowledge of schedules, routes, and vulnerabilities had become obsolete. They would need months to learn the new patterns, and during that time, they would be under increased scrutiny. The investigation, even though it had exonerated everyone, had made the entire plantation more watchful. But the changes also created an opportunity the twins hadn't anticipated. William Hutchins, concerned about his plantation's reputation and eager to demonstrate normalcy, began accepting invitations to social events throughout Burke County. These gatherings brought plantation owners, overseers, and supervisors together, creating situations where Sarah and Margaret, when assigned to serve at such events, could observe targets from multiple plantations in a single location. The twins attended their first such event on June 19, 1852, when Hutchins hosted a dinner for neighboring plantation owners and their senior staff. 23 people gathered at the main house, and Sarah and Margaret served food and drink throughout the evening. They moved through the dining room and parlor with their characteristic silence and efficiency, becoming part of the background while collecting valuable information. They learned names and faces of overseers from plantations throughout Burke County. They heard conversations about disciplinary methods, production techniques, and labor management. They observed who drank too much, who became careless with their words, who held grudges against colleagues, and they began to understand that their campaign didn't need to be limited to Hutchins Fields. Over the following months, similar social gatherings provided additional opportunities. The twins served at dinners, barbecues, and harvest celebrations. They accompanied Martha Crane to church functions where plantation management families socialized. They absorbed information about the broader network of control and violence that characterized the region's plantation system. By September 1852, Sarah and Margaret had compiled mental dossiers on 17 individuals across 6 different plantations in Burke County. Their original list had been exhausted. The remaining names had either died, left the area, or modified their behavior sufficiently to remove themselves from consideration. This new list represented fresh targets, but accessing them presented challenges the twins had never faced before. They couldn't simply move between plantations at will. Their movements were controlled and monitored. They would need assistance, or they would need to create situations where their presence outside Hutchins Fields seemed natural and necessary. The solution came from an unexpected source. In October 1852, Eleanor Hutchins developed an interest in organizing charitable activities for the moral improvement of the slave population throughout Burke County. This philanthropic impulse was partly genuine religious conviction and partly an attempt to rehabilitate the Hutchins family reputation after the troubling events of the previous year. Eleanor began visiting other plantations to assess needs and organize distribution of basic goods, additional blankets for winter, basic medical supplies, religious texts. She brought Sarah and Margaret with her on these visits, using them to carry supplies and assist with distribution. The twins' reputation as obedient and efficient servants made them ideal assistants for such work. These visits provided Sarah and Margaret with access to other plantations, opportunities to observe operations and routines, and chances to identify vulnerabilities in new locations. Between October 1852 and March 1853, they accompanied Eleanor Hutchins on 17 such visits to 5 different Burke County plantations. During this period, 3 overseers from other plantations died in apparent accidents. One fell from a horse and broke his neck. Another was crushed by a collapsed equipment shed. A third drowned in an irrigation pond under circumstances that seemed perfectly explicable. He had been drinking, had gone swimming alone at night, and had apparently suffered a cramp or heart failure. Sheriff Morgan investigated each death routinely, but found nothing suspicious. The incidents occurred at different plantations, involved different circumstances, and showed no connecting patterns beyond the general fact that plantation work was dangerous and accidents happened regularly. What Morgan didn't know was that Sarah and Margaret had been present near each accident site within days before each death occurred, visiting as part of Eleanor Hutchins's charitable activities. They had studied the victims during these visits, identified vulnerabilities, and acted with the same precise planning that had characterized their earlier work. But the expanded geography of their campaign created new risks. The twins were no longer operating in a familiar environment where they knew every building and path. They were working in locations they could visit only occasionally, relying on quick assessments and rapidly executed plans. This required even more careful planning and left less margin for error. On April 3, 1853, something went wrong for the first time. The twins had targeted an overseer named Richard Blackwell at a plantation called Fairview, approximately 8 miles from Hutchins Fields. Blackwell was known throughout Burke County for extreme cruelty, and multiple witnesses had reported his brutality to plantation owners who either ignored the reports or considered such methods necessary. The twins had visited Fairview twice with Eleanor Hutchins. During these visits, they had observed that Blackwell maintained a small office in a building separate from the main house where he kept records and stored personal items. The building was isolated, surrounded by trees, and Blackwell often worked there alone in the early morning hours. Sarah and Margaret had planned to create a fire similar to the one that killed James Pritchard, a delayed ignition that would appear accidental and give them time to establish alibis. They had prepared materials and hidden them near Blackwell's office building during their second visit to Fairview. But on the night of April 3rd, when they attempted to implement their plan, they discovered that Blackwell had changed his routine. He had begun sleeping in the office building rather than in his usual quarters. When the fire started, he woke immediately and escaped before the flames could trap him. The building burned completely, but Blackwell survived with only minor burns and smoke inhalation. More importantly, Blackwell reported seeing 2 figures running from the area just as he exited the burning building. He couldn't identify them clearly in the darkness and smoke, but he described them as small and moving together, like they were joined. This description reached Sheriff Morgan within hours. For the first time since his investigation of James Pritchard's letters, Morgan began to seriously consider the possibility that something beyond ordinary accidents might be occurring. 2 figures, small, moving together. The description could fit many people, but it also fit the twin girls from Hutchins Fields, who had visited Fairview with Eleanor Hutchins just 3 days before the fire. Morgan didn't immediately share his suspicions with anyone. He needed more than a vague description in poor visibility, but he began to pay closer attention to reports of accidents throughout Burke County, and he began to ask questions about who had been present near accident sites in the days and hours before incidents occurred. Sarah and Margaret recognized that their situation had changed. They had made their first significant error, and while it hadn't directly exposed them, it had created questions where none had existed before. They needed to become even more careful, or they needed to consider leaving Burke County entirely. The twins began planning an escape. The spring of 1853 marked the twins' 27th month at Hutchins Fields. They had killed 10 men across multiple plantations in Burke County. They had survived a thorough investigation by Sheriff Morgan. They had adapted their methods to changing circumstances and expanded their operations beyond their original location. But they had also made their first mistake, and they understood that mistakes would accumulate and eventually become fatal. Sheriff Morgan was not a particularly brilliant investigator, but he was methodical and patient. After the fire at Fairview and Richard Blackwell's description of the two figures, Morgan began systematically reviewing every accident report from the previous 2 years. He created a timeline of deaths and incidents, noting dates, locations, and circumstances. And he began to see patterns that he hadn't recognized before. The twin girls from Hutchins Fields appeared near many of these incidents. Not all of them, but enough to be statistically unusual. They had been serving at social gatherings where victims were present. They had accompanied Eleanor Hutchins on charitable visits to plantations where accidents later occurred. They had been interviewed during his investigation of deaths at Hutchins Fields itself. The evidence was circumstantial and would never support criminal prosecution. But Morgan's instincts, developed over 12 years as sheriff, told him something was wrong. On May 15, 1853, he visited Hutchins Fields again and requested a private conversation with William Hutchins. "I have concerns about your twin girls," Morgan began carefully. "Sarah and Margaret. I believe they may have information about the accidents that have occurred throughout the county." Hutchins's initial response was dismissive. "Sheriff, they're 13-year-old girls. What possible information could they have?" Morgan laid out his timeline and observations with methodical precision. The pattern of the twins' presence near accident sites, the description from Richard Blackwell, the unusual frequency of deaths among overseers known for harsh discipline, the fact that James Pritchard had mentioned suspecting deliberate agency just before his death in a fire, and now another fire at Fairview had been potentially set by two small figures moving together. "I'm not saying they're responsible," Morgan emphasized. "I'm saying they may have witnessed something, seen something, heard something. They move around more freely than most enslaved workers because of their duties. They might have information they don't even realize is significant." Hutchins agreed to allow Morgan to question the twins more thoroughly, but he insisted on being present during any interrogation. He also contacted his attorney, a man named Samuel Thornton from Augusta, to provide legal counsel, even discussing the possibility that enslaved individuals might have committed crimes against white overseers required careful legal navigation in 1853 Georgia. The interrogation was scheduled for May 22nd. Sarah and Margaret had a week to prepare, and they used that time to refine their story and evaluate their options. They understood that Sheriff Morgan suspected them, even if he couldn't prove anything. They also understood that sustained scrutiny would eventually reveal inconsistencies, no matter how carefully they maintained their innocent facade. On May 20th, 2 days before the scheduled interrogation, Sarah and Margaret made their decision. They would not wait to be questioned. They would not gamble on Morgan's inability to prove his suspicions. They would leave Hutchins Fields immediately, that very night. The twins had been planning escape routes for months, studying the geography of Burke County and the patterns of slave patrols. They knew which roads were monitored most heavily and which paths through the forests offered better concealment. They had hidden supplies, stolen food, basic tools, warm clothing, in locations between Hutchins Fields and the Savannah River, which formed the boundary between Georgia and South Carolina, approximately 40 miles to the east. Their plan was straightforward. Travel at night, hide during daylight, reach the river within a week, and cross into South Carolina, where different laws and different officials might offer slightly better odds of avoiding capture. It was a desperate plan with poor chances of success, but it was better than waiting for Morgan's investigation to trap them. On the night of May 20th, 1853, after the evening meal service ended and the plantation settled into darkness, Sarah and Margaret slipped from the kitchen quarters for the last time. They carried nothing that would seem unusual if they were stopped, just a basket with kitchen linens that needed washing at the creek, a common task that justified their movement around the plantation after dark. They had traveled less than a mile from Hutchins Fields when they encountered someone on the path. Robert Crane was returning from an evening visit to one of the outlying storage buildings. He was alone, carrying a lantern, and he recognized the twins immediately. "Sarah, Margaret, what are you doing out here at this hour?" The twins froze. They had planned for many contingencies, but not for a direct confrontation with the head overseer in an isolated location. For several seconds, no one moved or spoke. The lantern light cast flickering shadows across Crane's weathered face, and his expression shifted from surprise to suspicion as he noticed the twins' body language. Tense, coiled, ready to run. "You're running," Crane said, his voice quiet but certain. "You're trying to escape." Sarah and Margaret said nothing. They simply stared at Crane with identical expressions that held no fear, no pleading, no emotion at all. And in that moment, Crane saw something in their eyes that made him take an involuntary step backward. He had worked with enslaved populations for over 20 years. He had seen fear, hatred, desperation, resignation, and every other emotion that bondage produced. But he had never seen the cold calculation that looked back at him from the faces of these 13-year-old girls. In that moment, standing alone on a dark path with only his lantern for light, Robert Crane understood with absolute certainty that Sheriff Morgan's suspicions were correct. "It was you," he whispered. "All those deaths. Vernon Cushing, Douglas Pritchard, all of them. 2 children. How is that possible?" Sarah finally spoke, her voice soft but clear in the night air. "We're not children, Mr. Crane. We never were." Crane's hand moved toward the knife on his belt, a defensive gesture born of sudden fear rather than aggressive intent. But Margaret moved faster. She had been holding a heavy stone behind her back, picked up from the path while Crane's attention was focused on her sister. The stone struck Crane's lantern hand with precise force, causing him to drop the light. The lantern hit the ground and shattered, plunging the area into darkness broken only by scattered flames from the spilled oil. What happened next occurred in shadows and confusion. The twins, their eyes already adjusted to darkness, moved with coordinated precision. Crane was strong and experienced, but he was also surprised, off balance from the blow to his hand, and fighting opponents whose methods he didn't understand. The struggle lasted less than a minute. When it ended, Robert Crane lay unconscious on the path, blood seeping from a head wound where he had fallen against a rock during the fight. The scattered flames from his dropped lantern were spreading through the dry grass and undergrowth beside the path. Within minutes, the fire would be visible from the plantation buildings. Sarah and Margaret faced a choice. They could flee immediately, taking advantage of the confusion that the fire would create. Or they could ensure that Robert Crane, the only person who could testify to their guilt, would never speak about what he had discovered. The twins looked at each other in the growing firelight, communicating through that mysterious connection that had existed between them since birth. Then they made their decision. They lifted the unconscious Crane and carried him closer to the spreading fire, positioning his body where the flames would reach him within minutes. It would appear that the head overseer had suffered an accident with his lantern, been rendered unconscious by the fall, and been unable to escape the resulting fire. They worked quickly, arranging the scene to suggest accident rather than violence. Then they fled into the darkness, moving east toward the Savannah River and whatever possibility of freedom lay beyond it. Behind them, flames climbed into the night sky. Within an hour, workers from Hutchins Fields would discover Robert Crane's burned body and begin fighting the fire that threatened to spread to nearby buildings. By dawn, William Hutchins would be standing over his head overseer's remains, and Sheriff Morgan would be summoned to investigate the 11th death in 26 months. And Sarah and Margaret would be gone, vanished into the forests and swamps of eastern Georgia, leaving behind nothing but questions and a trail of carefully orchestrated deaths that would remain unexplained for decades. The discovery of Robert Crane's body at dawn on May 21, 1853, brought Sheriff Morgan back to Hutchins Fields with renewed urgency. The scene appeared consistent with accident. A dropped lantern, a fall, unconsciousness from head trauma, death by fire and smoke inhalation. But Morgan no longer believed in coincidental accidents at this plantation. When Martha Crane reported that Sarah and Margaret had not returned to their quarters the previous night and could not be located anywhere on the plantation, Morgan's suspicions crystallized into certainty. He immediately organized a search party and dispatched messages to neighboring plantations and the slave patrol system that monitored roads and paths throughout Burke County. But the twins had a 12-hour head start, and they used that advantage well. They traveled through areas they had studied during their months at Hutchins Fields, following paths that avoided the most heavily monitored roads. They moved with the efficiency born of careful planning, pausing only briefly during daylight hours before resuming their eastward journey. By the evening of May 21st, Sarah and Margaret had traveled approximately 18 miles from Hutchins Fields. They were exhausted, hungry despite their hidden supplies, and increasingly aware that sustained pursuit would eventually overtake them. They needed a better plan than simply running. That night, hiding in a small cave formation along a creek bed, the twins had a conversation that revealed the depth of their strategic thinking. Margaret argued for continuing east toward the Savannah River in South Carolina. Sarah disagreed, suggesting instead that they move north toward Augusta, where the larger population and active river commerce might offer better opportunities for concealment. "They'll expect us to run for South Carolina," Sarah reasoned. "That's what runaways always do. But Augusta has enough activity that 2 more faces might not be noticed. We could find work on the docks or with a merchant. We can pass for free if we're careful." Margaret considered this. "We look too distinctive. Identical twins are remembered." "Then we separate," Sarah said quietly. "We've always been together. That's what makes us memorable. Alone, we're just 2 girls among hundreds." This suggestion clearly pained both of them, but they recognized its logic. Together, they were instantly identifiable. Separated, each became less remarkable, less likely to trigger recognition. After several minutes of silent consideration, Margaret agreed to the plan. They decided to stay together until reaching Augusta, then to separate and independently establish new identities. They would not attempt to contact each other for at least 1 year, reducing the risk that tracking one twin would lead to the other. If both survived that year, they would attempt to reunite on a specific date at a specific location they chose that night. For the next 3 days, Sarah and Margaret traveled north toward Augusta, covering approximately 35 miles through a combination of forest paths and careful use of public roads during periods when traffic was heavy enough to provide concealment. They passed through 2 small communities without incident, successfully presenting themselves as enslaved workers on errands for their owners when questioned by curious observers. On May 24th, they reached the outskirts of Augusta, a bustling river city of nearly 8,000 residents. Augusta's economy centered on cotton trade, with dozens of warehouses, merchant offices, and processing facilities lining the Savannah River waterfront. The city's population included free black residents, a detail that the twins had learned during their months of observation and eavesdropping at Hutchins Fields. Sarah and Margaret separated on the afternoon of May 24, 1853, in a wooded area south of Augusta's main commercial district. They embraced briefly, the first and last display of emotion either had shown since beginning their campaign at Hutchins Fields. Then Sarah turned north toward the city's warehouse district, and Margaret headed west toward the residential areas where free black families lived and worked. Neither twin looked back. They had survived together for 13 years, through circumstances neither had ever described to anyone, and they had killed together with cold precision. But now, survival required separation, and they accepted this necessity as they had accepted everything else, with clear-eyed pragmatism and no wasted emotion. What happened to Sarah and Margaret after that separation became a matter of speculation and rumor throughout Burke County. Sheriff Morgan tracked their movements as far as the outskirts of Augusta, but lost the trail in the city's complex geography and transient population. He interviewed merchants, dock workers, and free black community leaders, but no one reported seeing two identical 13-year-old girls together. Several reports surfaced of single young girls matching the twins' general description, one supposedly working at a tobacco warehouse under an assumed name, another reportedly taken in by a free black family as a servant, but Morgan could never confirm either sighting. The twins had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. Back in Burke County, the investigation into the deaths at Hutchins Fields and surrounding plantations continued for several months. William Hutchins, devastated by the loss of Robert Crane and the revelation that his plantation had harbored murderers, cooperated fully with Sheriff Morgan's inquiries. Eleanor Hutchins suffered a nervous collapse and was confined to her bed for 6 weeks. The investigation's findings were summarized in Morgan's official report, filed with the county court on August 15, 1853. The report documented 11 deaths across 4 plantations between March 1851 and May 1853. It noted the unusual circumstances of each death and the pattern of the twins' presence near accident sites. It concluded that strong circumstantial evidence exists to suggest that the enslaved females, Sarah and Margaret, property of William Hutchins, were responsible for deliberately causing the deaths of multiple overseers and supervisors through methods calculated to appear accidental. The report also noted that the twins had escaped custody before formal charges could be filed, and their current whereabouts were unknown. Rewards were posted for information leading to their capture, but no credible sightings were ever reported. The story of the twin girls who killed 11 men and disappeared became a source of whispered conversation throughout Burke County for years afterward. Some people refused to believe that 2 13-year-old girls could have accomplished such things. Others accepted the evidence, but struggled to understand the psychology that would drive children to such calculated violence. A few observers, including Sheriff Morgan himself, eventually came to a darker conclusion. In a private letter to a colleague in South Carolina, written in 1855, Morgan expressed his belief that those girls were formed by something that happened before they arrived in Burke County. Whatever made them into what they became, it occurred earlier in their lives. We only saw the result, not the cause. And perhaps that's for the best, because I'm not certain I want to know what experiences could shape children into such perfect instruments of death. The records of Sarah and Margaret's origins were sparse and largely uninformative. The trader who sold them to William Hutchins had purchased them at an estate auction in Augusta in December 1850. The estate's records listed them only as domestic servants, trained twin females. No previous ownership documentation existed, or if it did, it had been lost or destroyed. The twins themselves had never spoken about their past, and now they were gone, carrying their secrets with them into whatever future they had managed to create in the anonymous spaces of the American South in 1853. The deaths stopped after May 1853. No more suspicious accidents befell overseers in Burke County. No more convenient fires claimed the lives of supervisors known for cruelty. The pattern that had characterized 26 months of careful murder simply ceased, leaving only questions and speculation in its wake. William Hutchins sold his plantation in 1854 and moved to Charleston, South Carolina. He never fully recovered from the revelation that 2 children he had owned had systematically murdered his employees. Eleanor Hutchins died in 1856, her death certificate listing the cause as nervous exhaustion and melancholia. Sheriff Morgan served as Burke County Sheriff until 1862, when the outbreak of the Civil War disrupted all civilian law enforcement. He never stopped looking for information about Sarah and Margaret, maintaining correspondence with law enforcement officials throughout Georgia and South Carolina. No credible reports of the twins ever reached him. In 1867, 4 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, Morgan received an anonymous letter postmarked from Philadelphia. The letter contained only a few lines. "We survived. We built new lives. We never killed again after leaving Georgia. What we did there was necessary. We were not evil. We were justice." The letter was unsigned, But Morgan believed until his death that it came from one of the twins. Whether that belief was accurate remains unknown. The handwriting matched no existing samples because the twins had never been documented as literate during their time at Hutchins Fields. But then much about Sarah and Margaret remained unknown, including how they had learned the skills that made them such effective killers. The broader impact of their campaign extended beyond the immediate deaths they caused. Throughout Burke County and into neighboring regions, overseers and supervisors became noticeably more cautious in their disciplinary methods during the mid-1850s. The fear that seemingly helpless individuals might possess hidden power, that violence might be returned by those assumed to be incapable of resistance, created changes in behavior that lasted for years. Some plantation owners installed new oversight structures, implementing systems where overseers were required to work in pairs rather than alone. Others moderated the most extreme forms of punishment, recognizing that excessive cruelty might provoke the kind of calculated revenge that Sarah and Margaret had demonstrated was possible. Historians examining the period have noted that Burke County experienced a measurable decrease in documented instances of severe physical punishment during the 5 years following the twins' escape. Whether this was directly attributable to their actions or to other factors remains debatable, but the correlation exists in the historical record. The ultimate fate of Sarah and Margaret remains one of the many mysteries surrounding their story. Did they survive the chaos of the Civil War years? Did they successfully establish independent lives under assumed identities? Did they ever reunite as they had planned on that night in May 1853? No definitive answers exist. But occasionally, in documents from the post-war period, researchers have identified intriguing possibilities. A woman named Sarah Hutchinson appears in Philadelphia city directories from 1868 onward, listed as a seamstress. A Margaret Hutchinson is recorded in Boston census records from 1870, described as a domestic worker. Whether these were the twins, using slightly modified versions of their former owner's surname, or simply coincidental name similarities, cannot be determined from available evidence. What can be stated with certainty is that two 13-year-old girls, enslaved and powerless by every legal and social standard of their time, managed to kill 11 adult men, evade investigation by law enforcement, and escape into freedom. They accomplished this through intelligence, planning, patience, and a complete absence of the mercy that their victims had never shown to others. Their story asks uncomfortable questions about justice, revenge, and the nature of evil. Were Sarah and Margaret murderers who deserved punishment? Or were they resistance fighters who struck back against a system built on violence and oppression? The answer depends partly on perspective and partly on how one weighs the value of lives in a society where some humans were legally classified as property. Sheriff Morgan's final written thoughts on the case, recorded in his personal journal in 1869, suggested a nuanced view. Those girls committed murder. That is fact. But they murdered murderers, men who wielded violence as casually as others wield tools. In a more just world, those men would have faced legal consequences for their cruelty. But our world was not just, and so those girls became the consequences. History will judge them, as it judges all of us by standards we may not recognize or accept. I can only say that I chased them for 4 years and never caught them, and some part of me wonders if I truly wanted to. The documentation of this case remains in the Burke County Courthouse archives, available to researchers who know where to look. The leather-bound ledgers from Hutchins Fields, meticulously recording births, deaths, and property transactions, sit in climate-controlled storage at the Georgia Historical Society in Savannah. The newspaper accounts from 1853, describing the mysterious series of accidents and the escaped slave twins suspected of causing them, have been preserved on microfilm. But the most important evidence, the testimony of Sarah and Margaret themselves, the full story of what formed them into who they became, was never recorded and is now lost to history. We can only reconstruct their actions from the aftermath they left behind, like archaeologists examining ancient ruins and trying to understand the civilization that built them. What we know is this. For 26 months in the early 1850s, two enslaved children with no legal rights, no social power, and no access to weapons or resources successfully waged a campaign of strategic elimination against multiple adult men who held absolute authority over them. They did so with such precision that each death appeared accidental until patterns emerged from accumulated incidents. They killed without being caught, escaped without being tracked, and disappeared into the vast anonymity of pre-Civil War America. Their story is part of American history, uncomfortable as that recognition might be. It sits in the archives alongside the sanitized narratives and the heroic myths, a reminder that history contains darker truths that resist simple moral categorization. The two identical faces that watched their victims die with eyes holding no fear, no guilt, and no mercy, stare back at us from that past, asking questions about justice and revenge that remain unanswered. What do you think about this story? Could two 13-year-old girls really accomplish what Sarah and Margaret allegedly did? Or does the truth lie somewhere else entirely, in explanations we haven't considered? The historical record leaves room for doubt, but it also leaves room for the possibility that sometimes the powerless find ways to strike back against power with devastating effectiveness. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story fascinated you, subscribe to our channel for more explorations of America's darkest historical mysteries. Until next time, remember that history is rarely as simple as we'd like it to be.